Hey guys, it's Courtney. I'm back here with another video for Trinity Stamps. Today I'm going to be using the Spring Fling Florals again because I can't put it down. Pretty sure somebody needs to conduct an intervention on me. So I'm working on a piece of Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock here, and this is cut down to 3 by 4.5. And I'm just going to start by stamping and masking my images. I'm not going to show you this entire thing because it's pretty self-explanatory. I'm stamping with blackout ink by Ink on 3 because it is a Copic safe ink, and I have 2 masks cut for each image that I'm stamping. I'm only stamping 2 of the flowers and 2 of the leaves to kind of keep it a little bit simple. And I'm just going to kind of move my masks as I go along. That way I didn't have to create more masks than I actually need to, just because sometimes that is a little bit time consuming. So I'm pretty much filling up the entire panel. I am leaving a little bit of white space, but for the most part, everything is going to be pretty much covered. I'm just, like I said, moving those masks around. I am using Simon Says Stamp masking paper because it is a little bit more tacky than most masking papers, and I need it to kind of keep that stick as I go along because I'm moving my masks around and reusing them so many times. Typically, I can get a good 5 or 6 uses out of a mask as long as I don't do any ink blending over it. So I'm just working to the top portion of this panel here, finishing up my stamping, and then I will carefully remove all of those masks. You can see sometimes I use the tip of my scissors to kind of get started on removing the masks just so that it doesn't tear my paper. Most of the time you won't have an issue, like I said, as long as you're not doing any ink blending, but just in case, this makes it a little bit easier to remove those masks. So once that is done, we are going to move on to the Copic coloring, and you can keep this as simple or as detailed as you want. And you'll see in the end why it won't really matter. So I'm just going to show you one of each of the images that I colored so that you can see the color combinations and where I placed my shadows. Because I'm not overly concerned about the coloring, I'm not going to start with my lightest color like I normally do. I'm going to jump right in with my darkest color and lay out my darkest areas. So for this particular flower, I am placing my shadows where one petal is laying underneath another, and I'm also concentrating my darkest area being towards the center of the flower, so that it looks like it's kind of bloomed out a little bit. So that will be the part that's kind of indented, if that makes any sense. Usually the darkest areas will make that appear that way once your coloring is done. Now this is an extremely dark color, and I did a video a couple of weeks ago for my Coloring with Courtney class where it talked about contrast and using that scary dark color. So you'll see once this flower is completely colored, it's much, much lighter than that actual dark color that we used. That's just to get the contrast. So I'm blending that out with the darkest midtone, then moving on to the lightest midtone, just flicking out that color a little bit. And I'm just leaving the tip of each of the petals for my highlight color, which is significantly lighter than my darkest color. And that's where you're going to get that contrast. So going to finish up with the R20 again, just for those tips of the petals, being sure not to go over the very darkest area and pick up any color that I don't want to be dragged out. So I colored all of these flowers the same way with the same color combination, and we'll move on to the second flower, and we're going to switch over to some V markers. Again, going to start off with my darkest color to get those darkest areas mapped out. Again, working towards the middle of the flower. This one's shaped completely differently, but there are going to be quite a few shadows on this one because each of the petals are kind of underneath each other. Some of them are folded over on themselves, which would also create a shadow. Just working with the very tip of my marker, just because I only need a teeny tiny bit of that dark color. Blending those areas out with the V17, just extending those out a little bit further. And then we'll move on to the V15 and extend those out even further. And we're going to save the highlight again just for those tips of the petals for the V12. And once again, all of these flowers were colored the same way with the same color combination throughout the entire card. So next we'll move on to the leaves. And again, going to color these the same way, but I will show you just a little bit of the coloring so you can kind of see where I placed my shading. Once again, going to start off, oh, I did color the middles of the flowers, but I didn't do any shading for those. So for the leaves, I'm not going to start off with my lightest color again. I'm going to go right off with my darkest, place a shadow where this one leaf is kind of folded over on itself, and add some shading to the base of the leaf and also the tip of the leaf, and leaving a center highlight. And this will kind of give some shape, or even more shape, to this particular leaf. So I'm going to show you this one more time. Placing a shadow where it's folded, a few little flicks on the base and the tip, extending that out with the G24, then the G21, and leaving the center for the highlight of the G20. For the smaller leaves, I'm going to keep those real simple, just adding a little bit of shading to the base of the leaf. Same color combination though, and we'll leave the tip of the leaf for the highlight. Once all of the coloring was done, I'm going to go ahead and fill in any white space with a C3. This is completely optional, but it does kind of help if you had any areas maybe where you went out of the lines. I do, because I'm not overly careful when I color, and this will kind of hide any of that without having to go in with my colorless blender, and it just adds a little bit of color to the background that will kind of make this panel stick out, I guess, a little bit from the card base itself. So once all of my coloring was done, we're going to move on to the scary part here, and I am going to cut up my panel. So I'm going to cut this up into 6 squares, and I'm going to cut these at 1.5-inch squares. So I'm going to cut right down the center and then make 3 squares out of each of those strips. And you can see that I'm kind of putting these off to the side in the order that they're supposed to go. It's not that big of a deal. It's going to kind of just be like puzzle pieces that you can put together later. But for me, this was a little bit easier to kind of just keep them in order for when I place these down onto my card base. So once the cutting was done, we're going to go ahead and bring out an A2 size white card base here. And I'm just going to arrange these on my card base to kind of get placement down. And then I'm going to start popping these up with my foam tape. I started off with the 2 center ones for placement reasons, and then I'll kind of move on to the top and the bottom. And this kind of just helps me with placement. You can measure. I didn't feel like measuring. You can definitely use a T-square ruler to make sure everything is straight. Also didn't do that. I kind of use my grid mat as kind of a guide to allow me to find the center of the card base, and kind of worked from there. So once those first 2 were popped up in the center, I was able to easily space the top and the bottom ones out. So like I said, pop those up with foam tape. You can adhere these flat, but I did want to add just a little bit of dimension. And then once those were done, we're going to move on to the sentiment. And I am using a sentiment from the Hello Sentimini stamp set. And I'm just using one of the single sentiments. I'm not using the large word. Going to take another piece of scrap Nina Solar White, and I'm just using my C3 to scribble on some color here so that it matches the rest of my background there. Going to go ahead and stamp out my sentiment with black dye ink by Simon Says Stamp. I'm not doing any embossing here, but you definitely can. I should have waited a minute until that Copic marker was dry, because this isn't a Copic safe ink, so it did bleed out a little bit, but not too bad. I went ahead and cut this sentiment down into a skinny little strip because I don't want to cover up too much of my background. Once that was done, I used my Tombow Mono multi-glue to adhere this right across the center of my middle squares there. I didn't add any more dimension just because I don't want too much dimension here. I want it to fit in an envelope. And that is it. That is the card for today. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the Trinity channel. Here's a quick look at the finished card. Thank you guys so much for stopping by, and have a great day. Bye.